joining me today from Washington in the Capital TV show, David DesRoches. He's a professor at the Nearest South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. Mr. DesRoches, good evening.
Thank you. Good evening to you.
The U.S. Navy recently seized a new shipment from Iran to the Houthi terrorists in Yemen. Can you tell us how you see the situation in Yemen while the Houthis are not cooperating to proceed in peace and stop collaborating with Iran and get guns and weapons from Iran?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Houthis clearly think that they have no incentive to settle or to enter into negotiations. They think that they can win on the battlefield. They've seen that they've been able to project power into the interior of Saudi Arabia. They've seen that Saudi Arabia in most of the West is blamed for the war. Not the Houthis themselves. The Houthis really have no incentive to negotiate. It hasn't, it's interesting, the US Navy has not said specifically that these weapons came from Iran or that they were going to Yemen. So they're actually being very, very tight-lipped about that, even while, we had a confrontation the other day where the Revolutionary Guard Navy tried to swarm ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. So, they're giving them the benefit of the doubt on that, and it's a significant benefit of the doubt. But the bottom line is, there's no real incentive for the Houthis to negotiate at this time. Why would they? They kind of think the whole country will fall into their lap, and they see that Saudi Arabia is really on the outs with its strongest regional partners.
Mm-hmm. But USA blame the Houthis for the humanitarian crisis, and especially with the fight or the war in Maghreb. So
yeah, that's true. Well, experts do and the government does, but this is a democracy. We're responsive to our citizens, and I've got to tell you that in spite of what expert opinion is, most people see this as a David and Goliath fight. They see it as a rich, repressive oil state that, until very recently didn't allow women to drive, intervening in a very poor, small state. And things like the UN Secretary General's report saying that the Houthi leadership has manipulated the humanitarian crisis and that it diverts humanitarian aid to reward its supporters and lets people who aren't members of the Houthi movement starve. That hasn't really entered the public consciousness here. The bumper sticker is you've got a big bad country beaten up on a small country, and that just doesn't play well with America. So there's not much support for Saudi Arabia in the United States.
It's not about Saudi Arabia. It's about that Griffiths. They refused to meet with the envoy of the UN. This is the problem. The Houthis are not collaborating. It's not about Saudi Arabia. If it's Saudi Arabia, they prevented the Riyadh agreement, but they are not cooperating. This is
Experts know that, and people in government know that. I mean, there's a long list of Houthi predations. So you've got within areas controlled by Houthis, there are violations of human rights. There's the execution of political opponents to Houthis. As I mentioned earlier, humanitarian aid is being shifted. The UN report of experts documented that drones that are being flown into Saudi Arabia have been assembled from Iranian counterparts and actually found the bills of ladings of components being shipped to Iran prior to them turning up there. There's been, the UN Security Council was taken on a tour of the various missile debris that was recovered in Saudi Arabia, and you can see the markings from Iranian factories in them. The Saphir, the oil vessel that's anchored off the port of Hodeidah that is, prone to breaking up at any moment and unleashing an environmental disaster. The various Houthi leadership in Hodeidah has refused to allow a UN inspection team to even make a survey. The list goes on and on and on, but you have to watch the event very, very closely to know this. And, most Americans don't understand that Hadi is the internationally recognized president of Yemen. But in a democracy, the well-informed people are not the only people who get to vote. They're not the only people. Everybody's opinion is worth the same in a democracy. And the bumper sticker narrative, not the in-depth, the bumper sticker narrative is a big country which has never been viewed entirely positively by the United States, and that's Saudi Arabia, is seen as responsible for this because they're big and the other country is small and poor. And all the other stuff is just for experts.
Let's talk about, there is an opinion that say to those arguing Iran should be provided sanctions relief, keep in mind that money going into Iran is used by the regime to fund and arm terrorism. This is talking about negotiation. So how do you see the situation here?
Yeah, so with the original Iran deal, the problem I saw with it was that, we have 4 or 5 areas that we're concerned about with Iran. There's support of terrorism, there's ballistic missiles, there's the nuclear program, there's their fact of taking hostages, and then there's the general human rights situation in Iran. The only tool that we're really willing to employ for that are sanctions. And the problem was we agreed to suspend sanctions just for one of those 5 areas. And so that in effect meant that if we then sought around and sought to impose sanctions on, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard soldiers who fired on the civilian protesters in 2009, or the ones who directed, their agents in Iraq to fire on civilian protesters last year, and the ones who are going around Karbala today, executing people who attack the Iranian consulate. If we put sanctions on those, the Iranians would say you're abrogating the nuclear deal. So that was always a problem. Money is fungible, and people tend to make that point only when it's something they agree with. But it appears that you can make a strong case that the initial sanctions relief didn't go a whole way towards improving the economic condition in Iran, not just because of sanctions, but just because the Revolutionary Guard controls a huge proportion of the Iranian economy. And, if the Revolutionary Guard controls a cement factory in a town, are you going to invest your money to build a cement factory? They'll put you out of business. I mean, the Revolutionary Guard kicked the Turkish government out of operating the Ayatollah Khomeini airport because they wanted the business for one of their companies, and the weight of the Turkish government was behind that. So they're never going to get that economic relief that they expect until they have a lot of internal reform that Iran's not going to be able to do while the Revolutionary Guard and the clerics are so powerful.
So at the end, the negotiation will not get any solution for the problem.
Well, there's a couple of problems. So the first problem is, even if all sanctions were lifted, people will still be hesitant to invest in Iran, because if you try to send somebody over to manage your investment and things go south with the Iranian government, they have a track record of seizing people under some pretext and holding them for ransom. So, if you say, okay, we're going to make a $200 million investment in a factory, and the Iranians put conditions on it that you don't like, they're likely to grab your people there, say this is a spy of the United States and Britain, and hold them until they get their $200 million. They've said that the British academy.
Mr. DesRoches, why America negotiate with a dictatorship? Is it weird?
Well, you can negotiate as an alternative to war in the ultimate analysis. Winston Churchill famously said, talk is always better than war. And so, the question is the United States willing to go to war with Iran? And the short answer is no. But Iran does not behave as a responsible country. So, what this administration is trying to do, and what the Obama administration tried to do, was said, look, let's come to an agreement on some small area, and show them the benefits of cooperating with the international order, not the American-led international order, the international order, the one that has led, China out of poverty. And then hopefully they will see the benefits of that, and then this cooperation will spread out into other areas. That was the theory behind the JCPOA. What JCPOA supporters would say is that never got a chance, because Trump moved away from it.
They want that the escalation will stop in Jerusalem. And do you think there is any relationship between Iran supporting Hamas to do all this, provoking the war and getting involved the people in Palestine and this conflict? How it will end?
I don't do a whole lot on Israel and Palestine. I really don't work on it. I don't think that Iran caused this problem. I think that this is, just the dynamic of the situation. I think that what is noticeable about this is that, the Biden administration came in and said, we're going to focus on near power competitors, Russia and China, and they wanted to minimize their position in the Middle East. And then I think that the folks in the Biden administration, they saw John Kerry spend the first part of his Secretary of State period trying to do an Israel-Palestine thing, and he got nowhere. And so I think, the people who are in positions now are people who worked with John Kerry on this. And I think they said there's no point in trying to engage on this. So this is the first presidential administration in a long time that has not appointed a special envoy for Israel-Palestine issues. And I think that, the United States kind of said, well, we can't make any headway here, so let's just leave it to itself. But the problem is you don't get to choose what becomes a problem in life. The problems present themselves. Iran is always eager to exploit a situation here, but I don't think they created this situation, the current wave of unpleasantness. I don't think they created.
They can benefit from it, no?
Yes. Yeah. They're not the predator birds that swoop down and kill the rabbit. They're the scavengers. Once the rabbit is hit by a car, they'll come and pick over the carcass. That's what Iran does. And quite frankly, that's also what they're doing in Yemen.
This Blinken said we're very focused on the situation in Israel, West Bank, Gaza, very deeply concerned about the rocket attacks that we are seeing now that need to stop immediately. And also, of course, concerns about the violence, provocative actions in around the Temple Mount. That violence needs to cease. All sides need to de-escalate, reduce tensions, take practical steps to calm things down. So the American administration or Biden administration are with Israel or with Palestine? Which side they are?
Well, the United States is always a strong supporter of Israel, but and I think that most people in the region feel that the United States is an uncritical supporter of Israel. But it's important to know. I don't think that there was a statement on there wasn't a statement that Israel would take as a blanket support when the original violence happened in Jerusalem. They really are two separate issues. Now, the issue of rockets being fired from Gaza in Israel, I think that everybody's against that. Look, for decades, the solution, the framework for resolving this conflict has been land for peace. And people forget, but Israel occupied Gaza and they left Gaza. So they gave up the land. Now, granted, it's still under heavy restrictions, and I no sensible person want to live there. But they gave up the land; they don't have peace. So, as long as you have an area that was evacuated by the Israeli state, and people forget there were settlements in Gaza where Jewish settlers had to be removed by force by the Israeli armed forces. So this was not a universally welcome decision in Israel. But as long as areas that Israel has evacuated, that land that's no longer there becomes an area that is a focus of warfare, then that undermines the basic concept that all these Israeli-Palestinian negotiations are predicated on.
Do you think that if it was like under Trump administration, this will happen? Because we never see the conflict was gone during the old administration. Why now it's come up? What was the reason? What is the causes of it?
Well, as I said, there's two issues going on here. So first you have the issues in Jerusalem, and then secondly, you have the Gaza thing. And I think that those are really two separate issues. Let's deal with the Gaza one because I know more about that. I think that it is quite possible, when you look at the Hamas strategy and the Islamic Jihad strategy of trying to launch attacks into Israel, they've tried for things that will overwhelm Israeli defenses. So they've tried tunnels, they've tried rockets. And it seems that what they've settled on is massing rocket attacks from areas that are inhabited, so that if Israel tries to retaliate, they'll kill women and children. And what they've realized is that the Iron Dome system is, pretty good against the level of rockets they have. But like all air defense systems, it has a fixed number of interceptors. And so, if it can shoot down 20 rockets at once, you just have to fire 25. So I think that it is when all is said and done, this is just a guess. I don't know, but this is a guess. So I'm thinking this as an engineer. I think that the reason why this is happening now, talking about Gaza, is that they just had to have time to build up enough rockets to fire. And then once they built up enough where they think with confidence they can overwhelm the Iron Dome defenses, then they were waiting for a pretext. And, they were waiting for some sort of justification, and that was the incidents in Jerusalem. And about those, I really don't know enough to comment on.
All right. Today, the United States is designating the 7 individuals involved in financial operations with Hezbollah ties to continue impeding the group's ability to operate in the global financial system. United States is designating these individuals pursuant to Executive Order 13224 for acting for or on behalf of Hezbollah and Al-Qard al-Hassan. This is, of course, an entity related to Hezbollah. How do you see the Biden, do they have a strategy to combat Hezbollah and its terrorism?
I don't think that there's a comprehensive anti-Hezbollah strategy in the Biden administration, or to be honest, in the Trump administration. I think that the Trump administration saw Hezbollah through an Iranian prism. And I think that in the Biden administration, it's so early in there. I think that what they're doing is not approaching things with a strategic sense, but they're looking at individual actions and behaviors, and where they identify Hezbollah affiliated entities or indeed Al Qaeda or Daesh, then they impose sanctions in response to specific actions, not as part of a strategy. Trump deserves credit. He really expanded sanctions as an instrument of national security policy. And what he did, particularly with regards to Hezbollah, was in the past, if a Hezbollah member, if a Hezbollah operative in South Lebanon managed to embed himself in the Lebanese government, past administration said, well, he's Lebanese, even though, he took his orders from Iran. They said, well, he's Lebanese, we don't want to provoke them. The Trump administration sanctioned members of the Lebanese parliament. And the response from Hezbollah's allies in South Lebanon or in Beirut was immediate. They said, oh my God, this is Trump, countering the Lebanese state. But I think it was a recognition that, Lebanon is not a wholly sovereign country, and that there are members who, there are people who serve Iran's interests, who carry arms, who do not conform to the rules of the Lebanese state, but acquired some status in the Lebanese state, as there are in Iraq as well. And that we are going to treat these actors, regardless of, whose skin they cover themselves in, whether it's the skin of the Lebanese state, we are going to treat them as Iranian agents hostile to the United States. And I don't think Biden's going to walk that back, because I think that, quite frankly, is the way to go.
This is very brave. How do you think about the UAE and USA relationship? There was a phone call lately between the President Biden and the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, and there was the F-35 deal was stopped, and then it went through smoothly. So how do you think this relationship will go on?
Well, so, I spoke earlier of how the United States has never been entirely comfortable with Saudi Arabia. The UAE kind of falls into that same bin, but the UAE is smarter, more nimble, more agile, and they're better at presenting themselves to the West in general and to the United States specifically. A big part of that has to go to the UAE ambassador, Yusuf El Taiba. He's probably the most effective ambassador in Washington, D.C. So since he's been the ambassador of the UAE, I think the Saudis have had 1, 2, 3, 4. I think it's either 5 or 6 ambassadors, and not all of them have been experienced.
Without the comparison between the two countries.
Well, but basically there's the same level of unease. But basically the UAE does things very, very smart. And they do take into account American political considerations before they do an act, and they package things in a way that's more palatable to the United States. The Saudis haven't been quite as good at that. So the relationship is roughly the same, but it's always better with the UAE, just because the UAE manages it better. So, the Joint Strike Fighter sale, that was closely associated with the Trump administration. And there were a lot of people in the Democratic Party, particularly during the primaries, who felt that Trump was giving a blank check to the Arab states of the Gulf, and that he was not properly thinking out considerations of technology transfer, that he was arming, dictators. So in the campaign, Biden said that he would review that. Once he got into office, he announced, okay, I'm going to pause and review it. That went on for less than 100 days. And then he said, okay, it's going to go forward. I said at the time of the suspension that this is meaningless, because those airplanes, they're not sitting in a warehouse ready to ship. They have to be designed and they have to be built. Those airplanes will not be ready for 5 years at least. And so it really was a pause that had.
But UAE is capable to have this weapon, this kind of weapon.
They probably will be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They probably will be. They have flown advanced American fighter aircraft for decades. They put a lot of effort into training their armed forces, at least at the pilot level. They have. You don't find a lot of pilots who are princes. It seems to be they seem to be a more meritocratic based armed forces than some others in the region.
And we are very sure that it will not go to another party or third party. So this is very clear.
I think so. Yeah. They have a good record on that. And part of it is because they're so small, so they're able to work well with us. It's a very small country with an outsized military establishment that they have really put a lot of effort into building. Whereas a lot of other countries in the region, they view that building a military is just a function of buying equipment. The UAE has actually gone about it in the right way, I think.
Dave, I want to thank you for this interview. Thank you for your time.
Oh, it's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.